with my head throbbing and clutching my hand bag tightly to my chest. I walked quickly through the indoor parking garage, a massive concrete structure. Every space was full. Cars of all makes and models squeezed between the lines. I was running late for my niece's 5th birthday. I find family occasions overwhelming. The innocent yet gut-wrenching questions like, when are you going to meet a nice young man and settle down? And the worst one, have you tried online dating? I just smile and give a rehearsed answer about my career. I continued to hurry through the parking garage. I stopped and scanned the area. I simply couldn't remember where I parked. My head was still throbbing, pounding to be exact. I never suffered from migraines, but that's the only way to describe it. That, or a jackhammer to my temple. I reached into my handbag and took out a small bottle of pills. I swallowed a few pills, no water needed. A slight relief. I continued to look for my car. My car was a Mini, the opposite of all my friends' giant soccer mom vans. It suited me, small and understated. When I was young, my grandparents called me their little wallflower. However, unlike most kids, I never blossomed. Where did I park the damn thing? Although no one was nearby, I felt acute embarrassment. Let's be brutally honest, everyone at some point has forgotten where they've parked, but they usually remember pretty quickly. Okay, let's regroup. My car must be here, otherwise how did I get here? Determined, I searched every row, car by car. I must have seen hundreds, maybe thousands of cars. The parking garage felt endless. The more I searched, the more my head began to pound and pound. It felt like my temples were going to burst. Again, I reached into my handbag and popped some pills. With hindsight, taking this sheer amount of medication should have raised alarm bells or rendered me unconscious. But at the time I was so focused on getting to my niece's birthday party, it didn't even register. I would never forgive myself if I missed my niece's birthday. It hit me, would anyone even know that I wasn't there? I wandered around the parking garage aimlessly. This is crazy, my car has to be somewhere. I spotted a tiny security booth by the entrance gates. Great, the surveillance cameras will show me exactly where I've parked. Soon this ridiculous ordeal will be behind me and no one will ever know. I looked inside the security booth. There was an empty chair and a grainy old monitor. I waited for a while, but no attendant showed up. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I strained to look at the monitor. The parking garage remained perfectly still. The time on the screen was 5:30. It suddenly dawned on me that since I entered the parking garage, no cars have arrived or left. I had no choice but to leave the parking garage. The security attendant never showed up. As I went outside, my headache roared back. It was relentless. I couldn't shake it. Swirling thoughts raced through my mind. Why did I not see anyone else in the parking garage? And did I actually park there? In the distance, I saw a large shopping mall. Maybe someone in there can help me find my car. After all, it must be where the shoppers park. I entered the bland 1990s shopping mall with 2 levels and a giant escalator in the center. The mall was packed with shoppers of all ages and ethnicities. I was forced to weave through several shoppers. I tried to catch a few of them in the eye, but they never looked back at me. It was like I was invisible, but I was used to that. I walked past several pointless stores where young store clerks mindlessly stacked shelves. One store that caught my attention was a clock store. It seemed misplaced. The store had every type of clock imaginable, from grandfather to cuckoo. I noticed that the time on each clock was 5:30. Surely that can't be right. That's the same time as the security monitor. I quickly checked my cell phone, and the time was indeed 5:30. I continued on tentatively. I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I passed a small drugstore, and my attention was drawn to a young, disheveled homeless guy with a large rucksack slung over his shoulder. He clutched his back as he picked up a packet of bandages from a shelf. He turned and stared at me. We locked eyes for a little too long. It wasn't sexual. I just knew that I had seen him before, but I couldn't remember where or when. I broke eye contact and moved on. I didn't have time to hang around. I needed to find someone who could help locate my car. I needed to get to my niece's birthday party. I looked up to the 2nd level and saw the Holy Grail, an information desk. I stepped onto the escalator, but they stopped working, so I was forced to walk up. My legs felt heavy, and my head continued to pound. The escalator on the other side worked fine. Shoppers whizzed past me, looking straight ahead, their eyes glazed over. I finally reached the 2nd level. As I stepped off, Shoppers whizzed up behind me. I rolled my eyes. Did the escalator really just start working? I wasn't surprised based on the day I was having. Irritated, I marched over to the super large information desk, which would fit perfectly in a 90s sitcom. As I arrived, a young female attendant flicked over the "I'm on a break" sign and left. I shouted out, excuse me," but she didn't hear me. I stood there in disbelief, my head pounding harder and harder. I instinctively popped some pills. My headache remained. The relief was becoming less every time. The guilt of missing my niece's birthday preyed upon me. So, I impulsively followed the attendant through a back staff door. What's the worst that can happen? I get thrown out by a mall cop and they escort me to my car. I entered a dark corridor with a faint light at the end. I slowly walked along the corridor. My inner monologue was telling me to turn back, but I couldn't stop. I was drawn toward the light, but it became dimmer with every step I took. I heard a sloshing sound. At the end of the corridor, a middle-aged janitor slowly mopped the floor back and forth with dirty water. He didn't look up, oblivious to me standing there. "Sir, do you know where the young lady went?" I meekly asked. He turned his back and kept mopping slowly, back and forth. Losing patience, I raised my voice. "I need help to find my car." He moved away and continued to mop, a little faster. I snapped, "I'm late for my niece's birthday party." He tilted his head and looked at me with black eyes. He spoke with a mouthless face. "You shouldn't be here." I ran for my life back along the corridor. As I reached the door, I heard the sloshing sound. I couldn't help but look back. The janitor slowly mopped the floor, back and forth. I raced down the escalator, which was no longer working again. My heart rate matched my pounding temples. A blur of shoppers on the other side of the escalator flashed before my eyes. I headed for the mall exit. I started to hyperventilate. I couldn't breathe, my lungs empty of oxygen. I swayed from side to side. The shoppers continued to browse the stores. No one stopped to help. I stumbled toward the automatic doors. I needed oxygen. My body was shutting down, but the automatic doors wouldn't open for me. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath. Shoppers stepped past me, and the automatic doors opened. Unable to breathe, I reached out my hand. A hand grasped my hand and pulled me outside. I desperately sucked in oxygen. I gazed up and saw the young homeless guy looking back at me. Little breaths, he tells me. His presence made me calmer, and I breathed in and out. I know him, but how? I quickly rose to my feet and looked him straight in the eye. "Who are you?" I bluntly asked. I immediately regretted my tone, but I needed to know. The young homeless guy looked at me with his kind yet sad eyes. "I'm Thomas, but everyone calls me Beansy," he replied. "I prefer Thomas, but no one calls me Thomas." "Why did you help me?" I bluntly asked. I regretted my tone once again. "Pause, you're the first person who's looked at me today," he replied. "We've got that in common," I replied. "What's your name?" he asked. "Penelope, though my parents only called me that when I was naughty," I answered. "I was rarely naughty, so everyone called me Penny. I prefer Penelope." Thomas smiled. "Penelope, we've got that in common as well." We shook hands. "What brings you here?" Thomas asked. It seemed like an innocuous question, but I felt there was more behind it. Does he know why I'm here? But how can he know when I don't even know? Of course, deep down I knew why I was here, but if I couldn't admit it to myself, how could I admit it to a stranger? I hesitated. "I'm here to pick up a few things for my niece's birthday party." He studied me for a moment. I quickly changed the subject. "I forgot where I parked," I told him. Thomas chuckled, and I tapped him on the side. "That's not funny." He winced and clutched his lower back. "Sorry," I said. "I'm fine," he sharply replied. He glanced at his watch. I noticed that the time on his watch was 5:30. Before I can say anything, he told me, "My train's about to leave soon." "Thank you, Thomas," I said. "Will you be okay?" he asked. "I'm just going to get an Uber. I'll figure out the car situation another time," I replied. Thomas smiled and walked away. I noticed that every few seconds he clutched his lower back. I watched him till he was out of sight. Will I see him again? Something told me inside. He knew the reason why I couldn't remember where I'd parked. Okay, so I need to refocus. I've been here way too long, and my niece's birthday party will be over soon. It hit me again. Would anyone even notice that I wasn't there? I took my cell phone from my handbag and tried to book an Uber. There were no drivers available in the area. That's strange. I know it's not New York, but it's still a town. Undeterred, I googled for cab agencies, and there was only one agency. I went straight through to a male operator. I could hear sirens in the background. The operator asked, "Where is your location?" My head started to pound again, As I realized I didn't actually know where I was, I quickly tried to search Google Maps, but I couldn't focus on the screen. It was all a blur. A monotone operator repeated, "Where is your location?" I tried to ask a passerby, but they ignored me and entered the mall. In desperation, I grabbed an elderly lady's arm and asked her, "Where am I?" She turned, and her dark eyes pierced through me. I quickly released her arm, and she carried on into the mall. The operator repeated the same question, "Where is your location?" I tried to describe the town. "There's this mall." The operator repeated, "Where is your location?" My head felt like it was going to explode. I shouted at the operator, "I can't find my car." The operator gave the same cold response, "Where is your location?" I couldn't answer, and I was forced to end the call. I looked around the town. I was lost. I popped some pills and walked quickly through the gray concrete town. I arrived at a small, old railway station with 2 empty tracks. I had no idea which direction I needed to go, but it didn't matter. I just needed to leave this place. Something was terribly wrong. On the platform, Thomas sat on a bench with his headphones on. He was singing a country song. I couldn't make out the song, but I remembered thinking he had a pleasant voice. I must admit I was relieved to see him, but also concerned he was still waiting. I tentatively sat beside him, leaving plenty of space. Thomas removed his headphones and looked at me with his kind, sad eyes. I noticed there was no song playing on his cell phone. "So, what happened to your Uber?" he asked. "No drivers in my area," I replied. I was too embarrassed to mention the cab incident. It's too bad he knows that I couldn't remember where I'd parked. As he was about to put his headphones back in, I asked him, "When's the train supposed to leave?" 5:30, he replied. He checked his watch, and it was still 5:30. "It must be broken," he added. I checked my cell phone, and the time was 5:30. I stared at him. "It's not just your watch that is broken." We both waited in silence. No trains arrived or left the platform. I couldn't tell you how long we waited. It could have been minutes or hours. It's difficult to judge when time appears to stop. Eventually, Thomas broke the silence. "Where are you going?" "My niece's birthday party," I replied. "How old is she?" he asked. With a glint in my eye, I answered, 5, and I'm her favorite aunt. He quickly followed up with another question, "Why are you late for the party?" I glared back at him. It's like he already knew, but wanted me to clarify. But how does he know? And how does he fit into all of this? Of course, I knew the answer, but it was still too painful to admit. I quickly changed the subject. "Where are you going with such a large rucksack?" I must admit it did cross my mind that instead of going he could be escaping. "Going home," he replied. "It's been too long." I smiled. "I'm sure your family will be pleased." He then proceeded to tell me his life story about being the black sheep of the family. I could see the pain and rejection in his eyes. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask him why his parents kicked him out, but everyone deserves a second chance. I hoped that my family would forgive me for missing my niece's birthday party. By now, I realized I wasn't going to make it. My only focus now was to leave this town. Thomas looked me in the eye and told me the real reason he was going back. I need a good bath. He jokingly smelt under his armpits. We both chuckled and went back to staring at the empty track. I popped some pills, and Thomas looked at me. "What?" I said defensively. He replied, "You've been taking pills non-stop since I met you." It was now dusk, and clearly no trains were ever coming. Together, we headed back into the town. In the background, the unnerving sound of sirens. Thomas winced and clutched his back. Blood seeped through his jacket. "You're bleeding," I remarked. He quickly replied, "Just a scratch." I wasn't convinced. Thomas dropped back, struggling to lift his large rucksack. "Would you like some help?" I asked. He didn't answer and picked up the pace. We arrived at the shopping mall, and Thomas stepped towards the automatic doors. I stopped, afraid to go inside. I had a strange feeling that once inside, I might never be allowed to leave. I came over all woozy. Thomas caught me as I fell. "When was the last time you ate something?" he asked. Inside the mall, nothing had changed. Shoppers continued to mindlessly browse the stores. We entered a 60s retro diner, where customers sat in silence across from each other in booths. It was like they had nothing left to say. We queued at the counter and gave our order to a cashier who barely acknowledged us. I kept the order simple: coffee and cake, one of life's simple pleasures. Thomas just ordered a coffee. I guess he lost his appetite. He was starting to look weaker. The cashier rang up the bill. Thomas looked down. I didn't mind paying, so I reached into my handbag, and to my surprise I lifted out a wad of cash. Why the heck do I have cash? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Thomas staring at the cash. We sat opposite each other in a booth. Do you get the feeling these people don't know we're here? I asked. Thomas gave a response I wasn't expecting. Can you remember the faces of everyone you meet? I felt guilty. He's right. We never stop to take the time to get to know one another. Even our close friends and family don't truly know who we are. My head started to pound, and I instinctively popped some pills. We waited for what could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. The diner owner, a large jovial man in his 60s wearing an apron, walked over and put down our order. He spoke with a gentle southern drawl, but like everyone else here, he couldn't look us in the eye. Ma'am, latte with a slice of cake, he said. And sir, one Americano. I stared down at the slice of pink birthday cake. The diner owner casually left. Starving, I started to devour the pink birthday cake, but it was chalky and tasteless. Thomas sipped his black coffee, which became slick like oil. He recoiled in disgust. At that moment, every customer stood up and left. The diner owner returned to our booth. Mall's closing, he told us. I need to speak to someone about my car. I remarked, let her eat and drink up, he added. It was like he was on autopilot. He then told us something chilling in his gentle southern drawl. You don't want to be here when it's dark. It's different when it's dark. The diner owner casually left. Thomas and I exchanged a look of deep concern. We exited the mall diner, still hungry and thirsty. The shoppers were leaving the mall in droves. I heard the familiar, disturbing sloshing sound. Dozens of janitors were mopping the floor back and forth. They looked up with their black eyes and circled toward us, mopping faster and faster. We ran through the mall toward the exit. You shouldn't be here, they chanted with their mouthless faces. It dawned on me, they weren't chasing us, they were warning us. We sprinted to the automatic doors, which were closing. I knew they wouldn't reopen, and we would be trapped inside forever. As the mall lights went off, we scraped through the automatic doors. Outside was now pitch black. Sirens roared in the background. Maniacal laughter echoed through the streets. I turned to Thomas. We're getting out of here. My car has to be in the parking garage. With only the moonlight to guide us, we headed toward the parking garage. Clutching his lower back, Thomas could barely lift up his rucksack, but still wouldn't allow me to help. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Is there something in the bag he doesn't want me to see? The maniacal laughter grew louder and louder. I glanced behind to see if we were being followed, and to my horror, the moonlight shape shifted into demon silhouettes. This must be a hallucination. It can't be real. I looked behind again, and the demon silhouettes grew larger and more defined. We arrived at the parking garage. Once inside the parking garage, the roaring sirens and the maniacal laughter stopped. The demon silhouettes didn't follow us in. Are they not allowed in here? Are there rules? The parking garage was still packed full of cars. What car do you drive? Thomas asked. I struggled to answer him. I couldn't remember. My headache had been getting progressively worse. It was as if someone stabbed a screwdriver through my temples. I popped some pills and closed my eyes. I flashed back to earlier, when I drove my Mini into the parking garage. Back to reality, I shouted out, Mini. We scanned the parking garage, and every single car was now a Mini. I stared at the rows upon rows of Minis in sheer disbelief. Use your fob, Thomas told me. I fumbled to find my key fob in my handbag and noticed the wad of cash. Why do I have that amount of money? I pressed my fob, and every single car flashed open. Suddenly, a wave of shoppers and staff from the mall entered the parking garage. They simultaneously got into their Minis and drove off. One of the Minis drove straight at us, and I yanked Thomas and myself behind a concrete pillar. I heard slow, loud footsteps. I peered from behind the pillar and saw the diner owner walking toward the last remaining Mini. I jumped out from behind the pillar. That's my car, he spoke in his gentle southern drawl. You don't want to be here when it's dark. It's different when it's dark. He gets into the car and closes the door. Please, take us with you. I cried out. We need to leave this place. The diner owner casually reversed out of the space. I desperately pounded on the windshield. Help us, help us. The diner owner drove off, and I was forced to step away. My head was on the verge of exploding. I chugged back the bottle of pills. The parking garage spun around me. I snapped out of my trance and looked over at Thomas, who was lying in a pool of his own blood. I removed his blood-soaked bandage, and to my shock saw a large, gaping hole from his back to his stomach. You've been shot, I exclaimed. His eyes glazed over. He whispered, I know. I wrapped my t-shirt tightly around his wound and call for an ambulance. My friend's been shot. I cried out. The monotone operator asked, "Where is your location?" I was forced to end the call. I realized no one would be coming to save us. I turned to Thomas, who struggled to keep his eyes open. "We're leaving this godforsaken town." With my arm around his waist, we exited the parking garage. Thomas limply dragged his rucksack along the ground. He refused to leave it behind. Outside, I nervously scanned right and left. There was no sign of the demon silhouettes. Maybe it was just a hallucination from my headaches. I decided to turn left. It didn't matter as long as we could escape to another town and get help. I struggled to pull Thomas along, who was getting progressively weaker. He still clasped onto his rucksack like his life depended on it. Blood dripped from his bullet wound, creating a trail. Sirens raged in the background. The demon silhouette's shape shifted from the moonlight and laughing maniacally followed us. I tried to move faster, but the demon silhouettes got closer. "Let me go," Thomas gasped. "We're in this together," I told him. "We're going to leave together." We were forced to hide in an alleyway. At the end of the alleyway, I saw a bright shining light. I had a sudden awakening. We needed to pass through the light. It's our only chance to leave this town. A jarring pain seared through my head. I collapsed Thomas and myself hard to the ground. We both lay there incapacitated. The demon silhouettes towered above us like skyscrapers. I desperately reached into my handbag for my bottle of pills, but it was empty. Thomas strained and reached into his rucksack. He took out another bottle of pills and passed them to me. I instinctively paid him with the wad of cash. We locked eyes, and at that precise moment, I knew who he was and he knew who I was. I flashed back to earlier, when I walked quickly through the streets. I clutched my handbag tightly to my chest as I passed a large, hooded gang who laughed at me. I spotted a young homeless guy in a side alleyway. I nervously approached Thomas and asked him if he had any drugs. It wasn't the first time I'd searched the streets for drugs. I was ashamed, but the humiliation of attending my niece's birthday party single was too much to handle. I just had to take the edge off. I had no choice but to get high. Thomas seemed unsure, but reached into his rucksack and handed me a bottle of pills. I took out the wad of cash from my handbag. Back in the strange town, the demon silhouettes engulfed me and pulled me away. I tried to fight back, but I stood no chance. They were too powerful. With this final surge of energy, Thomas lunged off the ground and pulled me back. I flashed back to the hooded gang robbing me of my cash. They grabbed my neck from behind and were choking me. I desperately tried to fight them off, punching, kicking, and clawing, but they were too strong. Thomas lunged at them and pulled me away. Thud, a hooded gang member shot Thomas in the back, who collapsed to the ground. I saw his eyes roll back. With sirens in the background, the hooded gang threw me to the ground and ran away. Crack, my head hit the concrete. Everything went dark. Back in the strange town, the demon silhouettes now had us both. They pulled us further away from the light into darkness. Thomas was too weak to fight back. His eyes glazed over, but I refused to give up and pulled us back toward the light. I screamed out, "We need to leave this town." I woke up being rushed on a gurney by EMTs into the ICU. I passed a janitor, with his eyes down, mopping the floor back and forth. I dipped in and out of consciousness. The doctors checked under my eyes with a light and called out my name, Penelope. I caught a glimpse in the neighboring room of doctors performing emergency CPR on Thomas. Everything went dark again. Back in the strange town, the bright light exploded toward me like a supernova. I reached out my hand, which was absorbed by the light. I was ready to pass through. I looked behind at the demon silhouettes dragging Thomas out of the alleyway. What would be his fate? Would he be destined to live for eternity like the other soulless entities here? The light had now absorbed half my body, but I couldn't leave him. I must save my friend. So I pulled away from the light and entered the darkness. With my head about to erupt and blood pouring out of my ears, I chased after the demon silhouettes, who scraped Thomas along the ground back toward the mall. Thomas' eyes turned from white to black, but I refused for him to become another mindless drone, and grabbed his rucksack that he still clung onto, a symbol of him going home to his family. I pulled with all my might, but the demon silhouettes wouldn't release him. The light from the alleyway became faint. I gritted my teeth and channeled every negative emotion from feeling unloved, unworthy, and embarrassed of who I am. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "This little wallflower deserves happiness." And with one final burst of energy, I ripped us away from the demon silhouettes into the light. My eyes opened wildly, and I found myself lying in a hospital bed. I spoke to a kind nurse "What happened?" I asked. "You were found unconscious in an alleyway," she replied. "What about the young guy with the rucksack?" I asked. She hesitated to answer. I presumed it had something to do with patient confidentiality. I looked at her with desperate eyes. "Please, I need to know if Thomas is alive." The nurse was taken aback that I knew his name. She leaned in close and told me, "He's alive, but it was touch and go. At one point he was pronounced clinically dead." I took a long, deep breath. While recovering from my head trauma, I regularly took trips to see Thomas. He was always asleep and hooked up to machines. A few weeks later, I was declared fit to leave, but I didn't want to leave. I needed to speak to Thomas. I needed to find out whether the strange town was real or a dark part of my subconscious. If we were there and the events actually happened, there would be proof of an alternate reality. Some would call it purgatory. I wasn't sure which answer I was looking for. Both terrified me. Only Thomas could provide the answer. So every day for over a year, I waited on a bench outside the hospital for him to leave. I was banned from going inside, so I had no choice. One nondescript day, Thomas walked out of the hospital with his rucksack slung over his shoulder. He was slimmer than I remembered, but looked fresh and healthy. Although I had longed for this moment, I decided to let him pass by. The strange town was my burden to carry, and I wanted Thomas to be free to move on with his life. Thomas continued to walk away. He stopped and turned to look at me. We locked eyes, and I knew at that moment what happened to us was real. There was an unbreakable bond. We had both experienced the strange town. Together, we left the hospital and walked along a busy street. We passed people grinding through their everyday lives, oblivious to the truth. Thomas and I don't say anything to each other. We don't need to. We know what happened. Up ahead was a street diner. Thomas turned to me. "Shall we get a coffee? It can't be worse than last time," I quipped. Inside the diner, we sat across from each other in a booth. The diner owner, a middle-aged, slim Italian-American woman, put down our coffee and cheesecake. She spoke with a thick Brooklyn accent. "Better eat and drink up." Thomas and I looked at each other. "You don't want to be here when it's dark. It's different when it's dark."